Hey y'all, Devin the Albino Jackass here, and in the video today we're going to be talking about my political journey a little bit. And a lot of this ties into my why I support Donald Trump video, but I really didn't provide enough detail in that video as to why I support these policies. So we're going to be doing that today. We're going to be talking about a lot of things. So we're really going to begin this story. I mentioned in my Donald Trump video that I was kind of raised in a blue dog Democrat household. Very supportive of organized labor. My grandfather retired from the United Auto Workers Union. My father held a number of jobs that were union positions as a welder. And I can tell you firsthand that when my father held those union positions, our standard of living was the best of my childhood. Good wages, we had a lot of luxuries that, it was when we first got the Nintendo 64 way back then. My father had a union position at the time. And me and my brother being disabled, obviously, we qualify for Medicaid. Well, when my father had those union positions, we didn't need Medicaid because he got good insurance through his job, obviously, through the benefits that the union provided. So always had a big support of organized labor. And this goes back to generations deep, my family being from eastern Kentucky, being involved in the Harlan County Coal Wars back in the 30s. And if, look into that, that's a fascinating topic in and of itself. So we've had a deep-seated support of organized labor going back quite a while. But also a fan of capitalism, not a huge fan of government intervention in the economy. And I've always had a very populist bend. I support tax cuts on the average people, not a big fan of corporate welfare, not a big fan of a lot of the tax loopholes and things like that big corporations take advantage of. Huge fan of trust busting. I'm seeing a lot of headlines right now saying Google's about to be broken up. Personally, I'm all for it. But also, I am a capitalist. I do not believe in state ownership. A lot of government intervention I'm not in favor of. But we'll get into that. So my political journey, I guess, really begins in 2000, 2001. I remember the 2000 election, watching the chaos of Bush v. Gore. I didn't understand it fully. Keep in mind, I was 7 years old. But that was really my first introduction, was the craziness of the 2000 election. And about a year later, when 9/11 happened, I remember being in school that day, teachers going off about something, and kids just start leaving about 9:30 that morning. I remember thinking, well, that's weird. There's a lot of kids leaving today. And a little bit later, probably 9:45, 10 o'clock, my principal comes in, he opens the door, he looks at my teacher, and he says, Lindsay, they just hit the other one. And my teacher stops what she's doing and flips on the TV. And for those of you who grew up in the same time period as me, you remember the TV bolted to the corner of the room. It was always real fun as a visually impaired kid trying to see that thing. But watching that smoke billow from the towers, this was right as my interest in history began. And I remember thinking this must be what Pearl Harbor felt like. Watching that smoke billow from the towers, you could see people jumping out of the windows. I can not describe to you the feeling other than it was just terrifying. It was confusing. I'm 8 years old. I didn't understand what was going on completely. All I knew was we were under attack. Kids were leaving. My mom came to pick me and my brother up, and we're like, what the hell's going on, She says, guys, today's a terrible day for America. And she took us, we lived around Lexington, Kentucky at the time. We came down here to eastern Kentucky in the mountains with my grandparents and stayed for a few days because nobody knew what was going to happen. They almost closed the roads. They almost closed the schools. No one was sure what was going to happen. It was this odd perpetual fear that lasted for about a month, really. A funny story, I remember going to school every morning they would play the Lee Greenwood song, I'm proud to be an American. And about the second week, my brother, my brother actually got in trouble for just go, man, I'm tired of this song. But 9/11 was a very, I guess you could say that was my political awakening. So when we went into Afghanistan, I was thinking, yeah, let's go get Al Qaeda, let's go get Bin Laden. I was a big fan of George Bush, ironically enough. But when we went into Iraq, I remember thinking, well, wait a minute. These guys had nothing to do with 9/11 or any of that. Why are we going here? My grandfather being a Vietnam veteran, as Iraq went on to that, we went into 2004, 2005. We captured Bin Laden, and we were still, or not Bin Laden, but Saddam Hussein, and we were still there. And this is really when I began to think, well, maybe America shouldn't be the world's policeman. Maybe we shouldn't do that. And from my dislike for Iraq really began my non-interventionist foreign policy stance. Now, I was also raised very religious, so I kind of began to lean into the paleo-conservative side of things, if you could call it that, when I was in 5th and 6th grade. Non-interventionist, but I believed that morals should be enforced in some way through law. And when I say morals, I mean Christian morals. Christian morals was anti-gay marriage and that sort of thing. Now, as I got into and watched the Bush administration's handling of the economic crisis, I really began to lean more libertarian. I'm in 7th, 8th grade, and this is really when the 2008 election begins, and it's my introduction to Ron Paul. Ron Paul seemed to make the most sense to me in 2008 as things were really starting to, 2007, 2008, as things were really starting to get crazy with the economic crisis. A lot of the political division that we see today really started at this point. But I liked Ron Paul. He wanted to get us out of Iraq. He wanted, government cuts, which I liked. I was not a big fan of the deficit spending. This comes from, this just comes from kind of a family, looking at it as the nation is like a household. You can't live beyond your means. But was really a big fan of Ron Paul. Now, a big reason for this is watching how they handled it. The too big to fail thing seemed insane to me. Nature adheres a vacuum. If you let these corporations fail on their own, things may get bad for a while. That's just true. But if the government intervenes as little as possible, it will correct itself over time. As I mentioned, nature adheres a vacuum. Somebody is going to rise to fill that void. And you can look, there's a historical example of this. You could look at FDR's policies during the Great Depression. There was a study out of UCLA that shows that FDR's New Deal policies probably lengthened the Great Depression by about 10 years. And you can see that reflected in the way Barack Obama handled the recovery from the recession. Watching that, seeing unemployment hover right around 9-10% for quite a long time. Barack Obama presided over the slowest post-recession recovery in U.S. history. It really put me off to any sort of state intervention, any sort of... I mentioned that I've worked for the ACA. I've seen how dysfunctional that is. I've seen how dysfunctional Social Security and Medicaid can be. It just put me off to a lot of this. And when you look at the welfare state, it holds people back in a lot of ways. I've got a video about why I don't like disability payments. This kind of ties into that. These sort of state income, social... And I'm not talking for people who are retired or somebody who is severely disabled. I'm not speaking to this group of people. But welfare doesn't really help. You can look at the Nordic countries that offer free education. They have a hard time getting people to graduate because it's just a lot easier to live off the state. That's just one example as to why I'm not a big fan of welfare. And coming from Appalachia, I've seen a lot of people abuse the system. I've seen a lot of people take advantage of it. And there's people that could really use that help. It's not so much that I'm against this aid, but we do need to make sure that it is geared to getting people off of aid. You don't want people being taken care of by the state from cradle to grave. It's a big, big problem. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are about 2/3 of the national budget. So, never really been a big fan of that. Now, when it comes to the 2016 election, we're getting into this. I watched when Donald Trump entered the race. At first, I thought he was a clown. I'm like this idiot. But a big turning point for me when it comes to Trump is when they claimed that he mocked a disabled reporter. Going back and looking at it, it was this weird arm motion that he was doing. But Trump did that to a lot of people. It was Trump's way of calling people stupid, not necessarily mocking this disabled reporter. And that's really when I began to realize that the media twists and contorts a lot of what Trump says and does. The Mexicans are sending rapists comments were taken completely out of context. And the media I hadn't trusted the media since George W. Bush. Not a fan of George W. Bush, even as a kid. But I always thought, these guys are going after him with a certain zeal that I don't see him going after other politicians with. And especially once Barack Obama took office, and watching the media fawn over him, it became apparent that these guys were partisan hacks. But around the time Trump took office, or not took office, but around the time Trump announced his candidacy was really the beginning of this strong social justice movement. I guess you could trace it back to Gamergate in 2014, but watching this ridiculously oversensitive, overly politically correct group slowly just get more and more crazy until 2016 they were burning college campuses down because Ben Shapiro was coming, or Milo Yiannopoulos or someone. And this is really when I began to shift from libertarianism back to conservatism, because watching libertarians flail around, not being able to crystallize a platform, libertarians got on my nerves because they're always fighting. It's always a purity contest. And you see that reflected on the far left as well. And you go and you look at the right, and again, this goes back a long ways. Now, I'm not by any means your standard traditional conservative. I still believe in limited government intervention. I believe gay married couples should be able to defend their pot plants with AR-15s. That's pretty much my political philosophy. I like low taxes on the working class to encourage economic mobility. I like low taxes on small businesses, again, to encourage growth and economic mobility. Not a big fan of corporate welfare, and you can look to the bailouts as a perfect example of that. Not a big fan of these Wall Street fat cats getting all sorts of tax cuts and loopholes. Not a big fan of a lot of these special interests. Not a big fan of money in politics. That's a place where I can agree with the left. I think I don't. This is the only thing I think I will ever agree with Cenk Uygur on, but that is basically legalized bribery. You shouldn't have all this money pumping into politics. You shouldn't have these giant corporations giving money into politics, labor unions giving money into politics, bankers giving money into politics. This creates conflicts of interest. No, I'm not a big fan of that. That is not a hindrance on free speech. But at the same time, I'm not a big fan of abortion. I call myself reluctantly pro-choice. I think that the safe, legal, and rare argument is the most logical to me. The longer a pregnancy goes, the more restrictions there should be, in my opinion. That's how I've kind of always felt. Now, I do come from a religious background. I am a religious person, but by that same token, I'm not going to tell you no, shall we say, especially in the incest or rape or the life of the mother. I may try to talk you out of it, but I don't think you should be forced into having a baby, especially in those three circumstances. Most definitely in those three circumstances. There's a lot of areas I break with Republicans on. I really hate every time they run cover every time Donald Trump misspeaks or makes a bad statement. That bothers me. I call it worshiping at the altar of Trump, where he can absolutely do no wrong and he's always playing 4D underwater upside down chess. Just growing up in the 90s and early 2000s and seeing what I believe that nation can be, a simple sense of unity in that we all have respect for each other, but we're not afraid to give each other the business, to rag on each other, to rip on each other. And when it comes to economics, I'm a firm believer in capitalism, but I also believe that these mega corporations and this huge gap that we see, the lack of economic mobility that we're seeing right now, the inflation that we're seeing right now, this is a result of a very top-heavy economy that we need to change. And that's pretty much where I'm at. I call myself a conservative, but there's areas where I'm open. You got to keep an open mind. Never pretend that you always have all of the answers. But that's just my opinion. One of the things that pushed me off to the left was watching this hardcore social justice movement. Never been a big fan of the welfare state, especially with the tax increases that brings onto the middle and lower classes. The rich don't pay for it. When you implement a lot of these high tax welfare policies, a lot of the wealthy just take their money out of the country. That hurts the economy. You need investment to make the economy grow. You need innovation to make the economy grow. You need economic mobility to make the economy grow. You need capitalism, but that doesn't mean that you have completely unrestricted markets. A lot of people don't like the tariffs that Trump put on. I'm personally a big fan of tariffs. I would like to see higher tariffs, lower income taxes, for example. Up until 1914, most of the government's money was made in tariffs and the sale of alcohol. I'm okay with higher taxes on things like tobacco, cigarettes, tobacco, alcohol, legalize marijuana, that kind of thing. That'll increase revenue to the government as well. The income tax, you could argue, is even unconstitutional. But that's another area where both the right and the left lose me, is they both use the Constitution when it suits them. They step on it when that suits them. And the corruption in Washington is one of the reasons that I really don't like to jump onto either political party, because both parties are corrupt. We see that. And my question is, why do we put up with this? Why do we put up with these politicians lying to us? We have the ability to get rid of them. What we have to do is we just got to get better about picking candidates. If somebody gets caught in a corruption scandal, you got to stop voting to them because they have a certain letter next to their name. I'm more than willing to vote for a Democrat if a Republican gets caught up in some sort of corruption scandal. Just temporarily, until the Republicans can get a better candidate. Normally I would be. But that's a story for another day. But my political journey, I started out as not really understanding politics, understanding that I loved America and wanted to see policies that helped the common people. And my political philosophy basically grew from that seed to a non-interventionist foreign policy. I especially would like to see a reduction of the surveillance state as well. You look at the NSA, the Patriot Act. These are blatant well, not the NSA itself, but the Patriot Act. A blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment. A lot of what Bush did when it came to the war on terror was, what's the word I want here? It blatantly violated the Constitution. It was blatantly overstepping his executive authority. Barack Obama overstepped his executive authority. Joe Biden overstepped his executive authority. This is stuff we shouldn't put up with as Americans. We should force our politicians to respect the restrictions given to them by the Constitution. We shouldn't put up with corruption. We shouldn't put up with these politicians lying to us. If you know a politician is corrupt, if you know you're being lied to, kick them out, even if that means voting in the other party for a little while. Especially when it comes to congressional races. You know, a lot of people don't understand how important that the Senate and House races are. If you want policy done, you need to give the president a supportive Congress, no matter which party you support. You know, I'm watching the political division in the country, and it's gotten worse. You know, it really started in the Bush years, but it's gotten obviously progressively worse over time. I would personally, we should have followed George Washington's advice that he said in his farewell address, and we should have just done away with political parties entirely. Because basically it just turns into a football game. It turns into political football, and one team wants the blue team, you know, one side's for the blue team, one side's for the red team. It's gotten ridiculously, it's just stupid. I don't know how else to describe it. But watching all of this as I've grown up, it has led me to this point. You know, I'm here I am 30 years old. I don't hold a lot of the same positions I held when I was 20. And a lot of you will find that that happens. You know, I started out as, if you had to put a label on, I started out as a very paleo-conservative guy. But I grew into libertarianism. And now you would call me, I guess, center-right. There's a lot of places that I am open to agreeing with the left on. As I mentioned, money in politics, strong support for labor unions, more collective bargaining rights, non-interventionist foreign policy, doing away with the Patriot Act and the surveillance state. If you can show me a way that, you know, universal health care and universal free college can be achieved without taxing the middle class into without taxing the middle class out the wazoo, fine, I'll listen to you. You might not convince me, but I'll at least listen. But I'm also I'm a capitalist guy. If you want to have these, you know, welfare programs, you need capitalism to fund it. So that's really where I'm at. If you had to put a label on me, I guess you could, call me center-right. But I think that's where I'm going to end the video, guys. Tell me, you know, what was your political journey? Where did you start? How did you end up where you were? You know, I started out from 9/11. I slowly watched what happened, and it led me to being this more center-right. I try to be rational, you know. I try to be understanding. Where are you at right now? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I've been the Albino Jackass. Thanks for listening to me hee-haw. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one, guys. Later.